Subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon to never miss an update from Rouse IAS. Do not forget to subscribe to our Telegram channel for all the updates and materials. Hello and welcome to Daily News Simplified, an answer to what, why, and how of newspaper analysis from the perspective of civil services examination. Today we have taken up Delhi edition of the Hindu newspaper dated 19th of January 2022. The articles which we are going to take up today have been displayed on your screen, and let us now begin the discussion. So the first news which we have taken for today's discussion appears on 2 pages. Escalation of forgotten war in Yemen appears on page number 6, whereas the Houthi attack on the UAE appears on page text and context. And both of them talk about the hijacking of UAE flagged ship Rawabi in the Red Sea by the Houthi fighters of Yemen. They allege that it was carrying military cargo. And the reason because of which India should be particularly concerned is that 7 of its 11 crewmen were Indians. So in response to this, Saudi Arabia retaliated with massive bombardment of Sana'a airport and then diverted a ship carrying fuel to Yemen to its own port. The Houthis have refused to release the vessel despite a United Nations Security Council resolution and have criticized the United Nations for siding with murderers who violate international laws. And so this Yemen crisis, which began in 2011 and 12 revolution against President Ali Abdullah Saleh, who had led Yemen for more than 3 decades, is still continuing. After Saleh left office in 2012 as a part of a mediated agreement between Yemeni government and opposition groups, the government led by Saleh's former vice president Mansour Hadi struggled to unite the fractious political landscape of the country and fend off the threats both from Al Qaeda in Arabian Peninsula and from Houthi militants that had been waging a protracted insurgency in the north for many years. Yemen, being one of the Gulf countries, is not directly economically or politically important for India's interest in that particular region. But the involvement of regional powers in the crisis of Yemen, the involvement of Saudi Arabia from one side and backing up of rebels by Iran on the other hand, has actually made this region extremely unstable. And so there is a threat that this instability could actually make the whole region lurch towards crisis. And when that happens, that would not be a good situation for our country because of the importance of this region for India. But apart from this, there are other challenges which India faces as far as relationship with this region is concerned. And so in the discussion, we are going to understand both the perspectives. Let us now begin the discussion. So starting with the basics of Persian Gulf region. The Persian Gulf includes 8 countries, as you can see on the map: Iran, Oman, UAE, that is United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait and Iraq bordering the Persian Gulf. Now Persian Gulf is very important region because the Gulf and its coastal areas are the world's largest single source of petroleum, which is around 50% of the world's oil reserves. Apart from that, the Persian Gulf has many fishing grounds, extensive coral reefs, mostly rocky, and abundant pearl oysters. The Persian Gulf has seen a lot of instability in past 20-30 years. It was a battlefield of 1980 to 1988 Iran-Iraq war, and then in 1991 the Gulf War where Iraq invaded the Kuwait. Now since this region is one of the world's richest when it comes to the mineral oil or fossil fuel, most of the countries and especially the developed ones have a very high stake in this particular region. But when it comes to India, we should clearly understand the importance of this region from the Indian context. And the acronym of 3E is apt to describe the importance of this region in Indian context. These 3 E's are energy, economic relations, and expatriates or diaspora community, which is also a part of your syllabus. When it comes to energy security, because 53% of India's oil imports and 41% of gas imports come from this particular region. And so you can understand how important this region is from the perspective of India's energy security. Whereas when it comes to the next T, which is economic relations, the India Gulf trade in 2019, 20 and 2021 was 1/5 of India's global trade. Apart from that, there are massive investments in infrastructure development flowing in from the Gulf region to our country. Then the last E in this relationship denotes expatriates or Indian people living in this region. More than around 9 million Indians reside in Gulf region, remitting around 40 to 50 billion dollar per annum. And to give you the extent of this contribution, it amounts to around 2% of India's GDP and two-thirds of the total remittances which our country receives every year. So you can understand how substantial the economic contribution of the people living in this region is to us. And so that is why it is extremely and crucially important for us to maintain the stability of this particular region. Apart from that, India has extended its strategic partnership with Iran, Oman, Saudi Arabia, and UAE. The Gulf region does not directly belongs to India's neighborhood, but it is definitely one of the most important part of India's extended neighborhood. What happens in the extended neighborhood impacts India's neighborhood and impacts India. For example, what happens in Iran not just impacts our energy security, our access to Afghanistan, but it also impacts Pakistan, which will have some kind of impact on our relationship with Pakistan as well. So now you can understand the multi-dimensional ways in which the Gulf region is very, very important for us. And so it is also important for us to understand what are the challenges which India is facing as far as relationship with the nations of this particular region is concerned. And the first and foremost challenge which India faces is about balancing the relationships. India has to maintain its relationship with Iran, but we know that US has imposed sanctions on Iran. So again, India has to balance the relationship between Iran and America all the time. Then India has to navigate the geopolitical rivalries between Saudi Arabia and Iran and Israel. And not until recently, when the Sunni states led by UAE and Saudi signed an accord with Israel, there was another challenge until 2 3 years ago, which was about balancing India's interests with Israel as compared to other Sunni countries. The increasing radicalization of the citizens of this region is a top concern for our country. Increasing incidences of terrorism, sprawling terror outfits, and probability of re-emergence of Islamic State is one of the top challenges which not only these countries are facing, but India is facing a threat of import of radicalization through its nationals residing in these regions. Then, just like each and every region in India's neighborhood and extended neighborhood, rising Chinese influence cannot be denied in this part of the world as well. With a growing Chinese presence in Iran, India is concerned about its strategic stakes such as completion of Chabahar port project. Then in past 5 to 10 years, these countries have enacted a lot of protectionist policies which have direct impact on India's diaspora. And the best example would be the Nitakat law, which makes it mandatory for the local companies to hire one Saudi national for every 10 migrant worker, and because of which there has been a widespread perception that the policy would lead to denial of job opportunities for a large number of Indians working there. Then, as we have understood how many expatriates live there and how important they are not just for their own safety and security but for India's economic growth. And with each and every crisis which emerges in this particular region, the safety and security of Indian national is also threatened. And then finally, the disruption in the Gulf region caused by the historically low oil prices and plummeting global demand are likely to have economic implications for India as well, because India receives substantial amount of remittances from this particular part of the world. Now, as far as the way forward or what government of India can do to meet these challenges are concerned, let us know in the comment section what according to you would be the best way to meet these challenges as far as relationship with this very strategically important region is concerned. Let us now move on to the next news. So the next article for discussion is a very important one, appears on page number 1. No one died of hunger in recent times, says Center. So the Supreme Court's questions on food security and hunger deaths saw the Union government insist on Tuesday that no one died of starvation in recent times across the country, even during the pandemic. Now this has brought a very important issue to the fore, which is of hunger and food insecurity in the country. From the perspective of GS Paper 2 Social Justice, this is a very important topic. You must be knowing that there is a line in syllabus which says issues related to poverty and hunger. And hence it is important for us to understand and learn few things about hunger. And hence in this discussion, we will understand what hunger is, what is the relation of food insecurity with hunger, what causes hunger mainly with respect to access, production and supply of the food, what is the current state of hunger in our country, and what government is doing in order to counter hunger. The three authors in this particular article talk about creation of resilient food system across the world in order to counter hunger. But as far as our syllabus is concerned, we need to focus upon mainly the causes of hunger, the current context, and what government is doing to counter hunger. So before undergoing any discussion on hunger, we should first at least define what hunger is. And we all have gone through hunger either voluntarily, willingly or unwillingly. And hunger is an uncomfortable or painful physical sensation caused by insufficient consumption of dietary energy. And it is really very difficult to measure hunger. But what we can measure are the manifestations or the reflections or impacts of hunger. When a person or a community goes through hunger for a long period of time, it reflects in malnutrition, mainly in the form of stunting and wasting. Stunting is basically impaired growth and development that children experience from poor nutrition and access to food. And wasting mainly deals with gradually reducing the fullness and the strength of the body, which in simple words could be understood as reduction in the muscle and the strength of the body. Similarly, long-term hunger gives rise to micronutrient deficiency, and surprisingly, hunger also results in obesity. And if you are surprised, we will see the correlation between hunger and obesity as well. So these are the manifestations of the hunger which can be measured, although hunger cannot be directly measured. So if we have to estimate an idea of the hunger, we can go into a population and measure the number of people who are stunted, wasted or deficient in terms of micronutrients, and the prime reason for hunger is food insecurity. When people lack regular access to enough safe and nutritious food for normal growth and development, an active and healthy life. Now this may be due to unavailability of food or lack of resources to obtain food. And the severity of the food insecurity may also vary, but there is a direct link between food insecurity and hunger. And let us understand that relationship. So on the left hand block, you have food insecurity, which is, as we have understood, uncertain access to food at the household or individual level. And on the right hand side, we have manifestation of hunger, which is child stunting, wasting, micronutrient deficiency and overweight. And we have to establish a link between these two blocks. So food insecurity can directly contribute to child wasting, stunting and deficiency by negatively affecting the adequacy of food consumption, which is the central block, which can be due to low quantity of food or low quality of the food and lack of continuity of the access to food. This insufficient intake of calories, proteins and vitamins and minerals will definitely give rise to child wasting and stunting. When a community is food insecure, then of course the mothers are food insecure as well. And when wasted or stunted mothers give birth to a baby, the chances of malnutrition being propagated increases much higher. So if an infant is born from a stunted mother, even if the infant is fed with a nice food, it is less likely that they will be able to counter the impacts of malnutrition. The mothers who are themselves malnutrition have to compromise on the child feeding as well, giving rise to child wasting and stunting. So this is as far as the malnutrition. But how do we arrive at overweight and obesity from food insecurity? So severe food insecurity is one extreme of the scale. But even moderate food insecurity is worrisome. For those who are moderately food insecure, access to food is uncertain. They might have to sacrifice other basic needs just to be able to eat. And when they eat, it might be whatever is most readily as well as cheaply available, which might not be the most nutritious food. And hence, more often than not, they resort to inexpensive, high-calorie, low-nutrition foods. For example, highly processed foods that are energy-dense, high in saturated fats, sugars, and salts, which are, in your own experience, you can see much cheaper than the fresh fruits, and hence they develop overweight and obesity. Apart from this, there are psychological factors also linked with food insecurity. The experience of not having certain or adequate access to food often causes feeling of anxiety, stress, and depression, which in turn can lead to behaviors that increase the risk of overweight and obesity. And so, we can understand that food insecurity is the basic reason behind the hunger. And hence, when we talk about causes of hunger, we need to delve into actual causes of food insecurity, which deal with the production of food, its supply, and access to food. And we will start our discussion with the production of food. Any phenomena or event or process which impacts the production of a food grain in a region definitely leads to hunger in that particular area, especially if that area is already poor. So what can be the factors which can reduce or annihilate the production of food grain in a region? And first and foremost among them is occurrence of a conflict or war. If you focus on the hunger map of the world, you will see that most of these regions are conflict driven, and because of the conflicts, wars between two factions and rebel groups, there is always a compromise on production. Then of course, natural disasters play a big role. And one of the most important natural disaster when it comes to hunger is drought. Often, drought persists for 3 to 6 months, and it directly impacts the availability of water for people, livestock, crops, and fodder production, and hence it negatively impacts the production in the region. Then, of course, we have a factor of climate change which is directly impacting the production across the world. In last 2 to 3 decades, the number of natural disasters, for example, cyclones, floods, and even droughts linked to climate change and their frequency have substantially increased. And the effects of climate change are often dramatic, devastating areas which are already vulnerable. So, for example, due to climate change, a major portion across the world which was cultivable is undergoing a phenomenon known by the name of land degradation, which is making those soils unfit for cultivation, reducing the production. So, these are the factors which overall impact the production, causing hunger. After production, the food grain needs to be supplied to the consumer and the people. But there are a lot of factors which directly impact and cut off the supply of the food grain or reduce it to a very minuscule amount. And they mainly deal with either the broken linkages or due to the lack of infrastructure. So for example, if a country does not have good foreign relations with food surplus countries, the import of the food grains will be compromised and will induce hunger in the population, especially when that particular country is not a producer itself. Then if the country is poor, the lack of infrastructure, for example, proper roads, processing, storage, assembly, handling, packaging facilities, will not exist in that particular country, and hence the people of that region will not be able to get the food. But apart from production and supply, there is a third factor which is often the most important factor, which is access to food, which is not the same as production. Because even if the food is being produced in a particular community, but people are simply too poor to buy that food, and so they will not be able to access the food, and hence they will undergo extreme hunger. And hence access is the most important determinant of hunger. And hence most major food and nutrition crises do not occur because of lack of food or lack of supply of food, but they occur due to lack of access to food. Food might be available, but due to the geographical location, lack of transportation and inhospitable condition, so that people are not able to access the food, then due to law and order situation, it may be difficult for the people to access the food. And finally, the market failure leads to the lack of access to the food because demand and supply are not able to balance themselves. So these are the causes of hunger. Of course, there are factors which are applicable everywhere. For example, disasters like tsunami and earthquake will impact supply as well as the access. Conflicts and wars will also play a role in hampering the supply as well as access. Similarly, if a region is poor, they will not be able to invest in the agriculture, and hence the production will be low. So all these factors together play a role in causing a hunger in a region. And so it is important for us to know what is the state of hunger and malnutrition in our country. And so one of the global indices, which is the Global Hunger Index, ranked India at 102nd position in 2019, which was improvement of one place over 103 in 2018. Let us know in the comment section whether you know about Global Hunger Index or not, and which is the agency which releases it. Also, you will have a multiple choice question based on Global Hunger Index. But not only that, we have Indian estimates of hunger as well, which was given in the reports of National Family Health Survey or NFHS. So as per the report of NFHS 4 conducted in 2015 and 16, we will look at the status of children as well as women and malnutrition. So according to that particular report, 35.7% children under the age of 5 were underweight and around 38.4% children were stunted. If we talk about women, 23% women have chronic energy deficiency or they have body mass index which is less than 18.5. Data in a single year is not important. What is important is a trend. And all these three numbers have reduced significantly. The women with low body mass index was around 36% in 2005 and 6. So in 10 years, we can see that this particular number has reduced from 36 to 23%. And so we can say that India is making great strides towards reduction of hunger and malnutrition. Also, it is important for us to know that this is a very, very important sustainable development goal. So not only for national strategy, but also for a global concern, we have to reduce hunger and malnutrition. We will look at the government of India's effort to counter hunger. Now here you should keep in mind that almost all the steps taken by Government of India will ultimately result in reduction of hunger, whether it is a poverty alleviation scheme like MG Narega or it is a scheme to target MSME sector, ultimately all go in reduction of poverty and in turn reduces hunger and malnutrition. But there are certain initiatives which directly target hunger, and those are National Food Security Act and various schemes of Ministry of Women and Child Development. So we can clearly see that Government of India accords high priority to issue of hunger and has been providing food grains at highly subsidized price to the target population through state governments and union territory administrations under National Food Security Act 2013, which provides for a coverage of up to 75% of the rural population and 50% of the urban population for receiving food grains under Targeted Public Distribution System or TPDS, thus covering about 2/3 of the population of the country for receiving food grains at the rate of 1, rupees 2 and rupees 3 per kg of nutri cereals, wheat and rice. Apart from this, Ministry of Women and Child Development is implementing Poshan Abhiyan, Pradhan Mantri Matru Vandan Yojana, Anganwadi services and schemes for adolescent girls under the umbrella of ICDS or Integrated Child Development Services, which are direct targeted interventions to address the problem of malnutrition in the country. Then the government has also initiated Poshan Abhiyan, and the goal of which is to achieve improvement in nutritional status of children from the age of 0 to 6 years, adolescent girls, and pregnant and lactating mothers in a time-bound manner with fixed targets. And these targets are prevention and reduction in stunting in children at the rate of 2% per annum. So every year, the Government of India has targeted to reduce the prevalence of stunting in children by 2%. Then prevent and reduce undernutrition or underweight prevalence by 2% per annum, reduction in prevalence of anemia among young children at the rate of 3% per annum. Anemia, which is a decrease in the total amount of red blood cells or hemoglobin in the blood, needs to be targeted. Then reduction in the prevalence of anemia among women and adolescent girls in the age group of 15 to 49 years at the rate of 3% per annum, and the reduction in low birth weight by 2% per annum. So these are the steps which are being taken by Government of India and which are showing the results on the ground. Let's now move on to the next news. The next article appears as a column on page number 6. Inflation conundrum. Inflation means general increase in the prices of the products and services, whereas conundrum means a confusing and difficult problem or question. So inflation has become a very difficult problem for the government because it has reached to such a level that it has now started emerging as a threat. Now, basics related to inflation have always been very important from the prelims point of view in civil services examination. Now, inflation is one of the very important determinants of economic growth, and not just economic growth, but the growth of UPSC aspirants as well. Because just look at this instance from 2020 prelims examination, where UPSC asks, consider the following statements. Statement 1. The weightage of food in Consumer Price Index CPI is higher than that in Wholesale Price Index known as WPI. Statement 2. The WPI does not capture changes in the prices of services which CPI does. Statement 3. Reserve Bank of India has now adopted WPI as its key measure of inflation and to decide on changing the key policy rates. Which of the statement given above are correct? And now you can easily understand how inflation becomes important for UPSC, especially the prelims stage as well. And let me assure you that this is not very easy question. It requires you to have a clear-cut understanding of CPI, WPI and how they are different. And so we will begin with that comparison, and then we will go on and understand how we calculate inflation and then what are the factors which are driving the current inflation rate in our country. And let me tell you this important coincidence. In the DNS dated 4th of January 2020, which is like 8 months before the prelims examination, we discussed this chart which has all the information it takes to solve this question. And so we'll start the discussion with the same comparison chart between WPI and CPI. So WPI is measure of inflation at the wholesale level, whereas CPI is the measure of inflation at the retail level. So you know that buyers exist both at the consumer level, which we form important part, because we don't go to the wholesale market for vegetables. We go to the local retailer or the grocery shop. Whereas the business people, the people who are involved in business, have to go to the wholesale market. And so the markets exist at two levels, and hence the inflation exists for these two different markets. And so that is why the calculation of WPI is done by Ministry of Commerce and Industry, because that is not something which is impacting the consumer directly. Of course, indirectly it does. But that is an easy way to remember who calculates WPI, because it is for wholesale market, and so Commerce and Industry Ministry is the one concerned with it. Whereas the CPI, which is the Consumer Price Index, is calculated by National Statistical Office or NSO under the Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation. For both of them, the base year is 2011-12 and 2012. Now, the basket of goods under the WPI is different from basket of CPI. Because under WPI, you have primary articles, manufactured products and fuel and power. And highest weightage is given to manufactured products. Whereas if you look at CPI, the one which is consumed or centered around consumers, consists of what we consumes or what we spend maximum on, which is food and beverages, pan, tobacco and intoxicants, clothing and footwear, housing, fuel and light, miscellaneous, which includes services of education and healthcare, and transportation, which is also a service. But the highest weightage is given to food and beverages. So on an average, an Indian household has the maximum expenditure on food and beverages, and that is why highest weightage has been given in the CPI to this particular category. Now, when the food prices increase, which is what is happening now, will it impact WPI the same way as it does CPI? Of course no, because you can see that the highest weightage is given to manufactured product, and so the impact of increase in food items is less on WPI as compared to CPI, since the WPI provides higher weightage to manufactured products and lower weightage to food items. Whereas the impact of increase in food items would be much wider on CPI because it has the highest weightage of foodstuffs. Now, as you can clearly see, there is no health, education and transportation here, and so under WPI, there is no service sector which is included, but it forms an important part of the CPI. Under WPI, there is no inclusion of taxes, whereas CPI has the inclusion of taxes. Now, we know that RBI has been given a mandate to maintain the inflation rate between 2 to 6% or 4% plus minus 2%. Now, what is this value, whether it is WPI or CPI? Now, the government does not want the average consumer to face the inflation at a very high rate. And so it makes sense that RBI is required to maintain CPI rate of inflation of 4% with a deviation of 2%, whereas RBI does not take into account WPI. So RBI targets inflation rate, which is CPI. And so let us now go back to the Prelims 2020 question and try to solve it. The weightage of food in consumer price index is higher than that in WPI, which is correct. We have seen that. WPI does not capture changes in prices of services, which CPI does, which is also correct. RBI has now adopted WPI. No, this is wrong because RBI has adopted CPI as its key measure of inflation and to decide on changing the key policy rate. And so the statement 1 and 2 are correct, leading us to the right answer A. And so often students ask about the base effect. What is this base effect? Now to understand the base effect, we'll have to go through some calculations. You know that rate of inflation in current year depends on the rate of inflation in the previous year because the rate of inflation is equal to prices in the current month minus prices in corresponding month of the previous year divided by prices in the corresponding month of previous year into 100. And so, if the prices were very high in the same month last year, which means that denominator would have high value and so you will have low rate of inflation because of base effect. Similarly, if the prices were very low, unusually low in the same month last year, your denominator will be low and hence your rate of inflation will be high because of the base effect. And so let us understand these two scenarios. Under scenario 1, let's say the price of an item A in 2019 May is 100 rupees and in May 2020 it is 150 rupees and in May 2021 they have increased to 200 rupees. So how are you going to calculate the inflation? For the first year, inflation would be calculated for May 2020. It would be done in a way by applying this formula. Prices in current month, which is 150, minus prices in corresponding month of the previous year, which is 100, divided by prices in corresponding month of the previous year, divided by 100, which is 50 by 100, which is 50% inflation. And similarly, if you apply the same formula, it comes out to be 33.33%. Because then you are going to subtract 150 from 200 and divide it by 150 into 100. Again, to show you how the base effect changes the whole game, you have the same starting point and the same ending point, but the middle point is different. So let's say for an item B, it starts at 100 just like item A, but in May 2020 it was 110. So rate of inflation was 10%. In May 2021, the prices have gone up to 200, just as the way item A has gone. But item A has 33.33% inflation rate, whereas item B has 81.81% inflation rate, just owing to the base effect. Because the base would be 110 in this case and 150 in this case. And so this is what is known as base effect. And so let us now quickly understand the reasons behind the inflation in our country right now. And there are 4 reasons behind that. Imported inflation, increase in certain food items prices, increase in services prices, and low base effect, which we just understood. So increase in global commodity prices such as crude oil, edible oil, all of us are feeling this particular instance of higher crude prices. And so since most of the things are being transported on crude oil, and so of course the increase in the prices of petrol and diesel would be reflected in everything else. Similarly, there are certain food items which are getting expensive, for example, eggs, edible oils, fruits and pulses. Similarly, the prices of health, transport and communication sector services have gone up, and we know that services are included in CPI. And due to lockdown last year, the prices of most of the goods had declined because of the low demand. And so that is why we have low base effect, which would reflect in higher inflation prices. Also at the same time, aspirants often come across such terms such as headline and core inflation. Now, headline inflation simply refers to the inflation in the CPI or even the WPI, covering all the categories of goods and services. So that is complete CPI and WPI. But on the other hand, the core inflation excludes the volatile categories, such as food, fuel, in order to measure the increase in the prices of goods and services in general. So you know that due to various reasons, some or the other component of CPI and WPI would deviate from the general trend. So for example, if the rate of inflation in general is low, but for let's say sudden reduction in rainfall, the prices of vegetables shoot up. But that is quite temporary, but that will take up the overall inflation trend high in that particular month. But that is not what is the general trend, and that general trend is called the core inflation. And so a drastic fall in the food and fuel prices can bring down the headline inflation by a large extent. However, the core inflation may remain unaffected. So don't get confused. RBI right now is targeting CPI headline rate of inflation, which is the complete CPI and not the core inflation. Now, a debate which has cropped up in last 2 years is that what should be actually targeted by RBI, whether it is headline, which is what is RBI doing right now, or should it resort to targeting the core inflation, because which is what is the normal trend. And so in this regard, Economic Survey has highlighted that the sole focus on CPI headline rate of inflation may not be appropriate on account of number of reasons. And accordingly, it has recommended that a greater focus on core inflation is warranted because of 4 specific reasons. First, headline inflation may take place due to volatility in prices of crude oil and food commodities over which RBI has no control. For example, failure of monsoon, lack of cold chain infrastructure, supply side bottlenecks usually lead to increase in food prices. And accordingly, RBI changes its monetary policy, which is going to have no impact on this particular inflation. Similarly, increase in crude oil prices, the import of crude oil prices is not connected with the monetary policy of RBI. But RBI is changing its monetary policy as a result of these increase in prices. Then second, most of the time inflation in food commodities is transitory and may not require any policy change by RBI. It could be just a 1-month phenomena. But RBI comes up with a policy for 3 months, and so that could not be justified. Third, if the RBI tries to control inflation due to volatility in prices of food commodities, it can prove to be counterproductive. For example, to control inflation, rate of interest would increase, which will lead to decline in investment and consumption expenditure, which will result in economic slowdown. And lastly, to measure inflation correctly, weightage must be assigned to different categories of commodities depending upon their share in the household expenditure. Higher the share, higher should be the weightage. And the share of food commodities in household expenditure has declined since 2011-12. Yet the CPI gives a weightage of around 45% to food commodities, as we have already seen. So I hope with this discussion, it was clear to you as to what the inflation, especially the WPI and CPI differences, headline and core differences, and how the base effect impacts the rate of inflation. Let us now move on to the question of the day. The next news for discussion appears on page number 7, Preventing Genocide, where the author gives reference to the speeches made by Yati Narasimhanand at a religious assembly, which have reignited discussion regarding hate speech and limits of the law. The speeches made included calls for genocide of a religious community in the country, and that can be seen as a part of an ongoing pattern of targeting minorities. And in this regard, she mentions a Convention of United Nations, Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide of 1948, which India has signed and ratified. Now, conventions like these, and especially the conventions of United Nations, have been frequently asked by UPSC in the past years. For example, in 2018, UPSC asked, International Labour Organization's Conventions 138 and 182 are related to, and the right answer was the child labour. Convention number 138 deals with the minimum age for being employed, and Convention number 182 deals with worst forms of child labour. And so in this regard, it becomes very, very important for us to discuss Convention on Prevention and Punishment of the Crimes of Genocide. And so, as the name clearly suggests, it is an international treaty that criminalizes genocide and obligates state parties to enforce its prohibition. It was the first legal instrument to codify genocide as a crime and the first human rights treaty unanimously, unopposedly adopted by United Nations General Assembly in 1948. Now, before we go into the discussion of Genocide Convention, it is important for us to first understand what genocide actually is and why was the need to create such a global convention for it. So while the definition of genocide has been very clearly laid out by the Article 1 of the convention itself, which says that genocide means any of the following acts committed with the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial or religious group. So it is not a murder of few people, but rather it is a destruction of a group of people defined into group either by common nationality, ethnicity, racial background or religious group. And the convention just does not define the act of killing or terminating a particular community. But the convention even talks about the intent to kill members of a group, cause serious bodily or mental harm to members of a group, deliberately inflicting on group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, and forcibly transferring children of the group to another group, which will ultimately lead to end of that particular group. So you can see how widely genocide has been defined by the convention. But the question arises, why did we need a convention in 1948 to deal with genocide? All those people who are well versed with world history would know that this was a context of World War II. And so this convention was conceived largely in response to Second World War, which saw atrocities such as Holocaust that lacked an adequate description or legal definition. Also, it was thought that whenever a genocide is carried out, it is usually by the state party. And so, the national laws would not be sufficient to prevent or forestall such a genocide. And that is why we would need a global convention to prevent such atrocities known as genocides. So what are the states' obligation under the Genocide Convention? The first obligation is not to commit a genocide. Then the next obligation is to prevent genocide, which according to International Court of Justice has an extraterritorial scope. And then all the state parties have obligation to punish genocide. So not only you don't have to commit genocide, you have to prevent genocide, and in the process of prevention of a genocide, even if you have to attack a country, which means if you have to take into account other states and stopping them from carrying out genocide, that also has been enabled by the convention. And we can easily appreciate why these powers are important. Then all the state parties have an obligation to enact necessary legislation to give effect to the provisions of the convention. Then the state parties have obligation to ensure that effective penalties are provided for persons found guilty of criminal conduct according to the convention. Then obligation to try persons charged with genocide in a competent tribunal of the state in the territory of which the act was committed, or by any other international penal tribunal with accepted jurisdiction. So these are the important obligations which apply to each and every party to the convention. Now, if you want to look at the implementation of this particular convention, you can clearly see that most of the countries in South, North America, Europe, Asia are parties to the convention, which totals to around 150. However, there are around 43 nations, most of them belonging to Africa and East Asia, which are neither signatories nor parties to the convention. And these are the regions most impacted by the acts of genocide in past 20 years. And apart from creating obligations on behalf of the state parties, it also creates an office, the Office on Genocide Prevention and Responsibility to Protect, which supports two special advisors who report directly to United Nations General Secretary. One of them is Special Advisor on the Prevention of Genocide, and another one is the Special Advisor on Responsibility to Protect. So while the first one acts as a catalyst to raise awareness of the causes and dynamics of genocide, the other one leads the conceptual, political, institutional and operational development of the responsibility to protect. As far as India's participation to the treaty is concerned, India is a signatory and it has also ratified the treaty, but India has not enacted any legislation in accordance with Article 6 of the Genocide Convention, which obligates all the state parties to create a national legislation. So this topic is highly unlikely to be asked in mains examination, and hence we are not doing any mains level analysis. However, a direct question in the prelims examination with respect to the important features of the treaty might be asked, and so it is important for you to keep into mind the convention, its important obligations, and that India is a party to the treaty but it has not enacted any legislation to give force to the treaty in the country. Then the next important news appears on page number 11, which is very important from the perspective of map locations. Rising sea levels prompt Indonesia to relocate its capital. Indonesia's parliament yesterday passed a law approving the relocation of its capital from slowly sinking Jakarta to a site 2000 kilometers away on the jungle-clad Borneo island that will be named Nusantara. The people of the country as well as the government has been extremely concerned with rising sea levels and severe congestion on densely populated Java Island on which the country's capital is currently located. However, the new capital will belong to East Kalimantan province on the Indonesian part of Borneo. And so this becomes a very important map location from this year's prelims examination. The last news for today's discussion appears on page number 4. 3 Navy personnel killed in explosion aboard INS Ranvir. So in an unfortunate accident, 3 Navy personnel lost their lives in an explosion on board destroyer INS Ranvir at Naval Dockyard in Mumbai. And we have seen in the past how these military equipments are very important from the perspective of prelims examination. So INS Ranvir is the fourth of 5 Rajput class destroyers built for the Indian Navy. The Rajput class guided missile destroyers built for the Indian Navy are basically modified versions of Soviet Kashin class destroyers, and hence they are known as Kashin II class. And as far as guided missile destroyers are concerned, they are destroyers designed to launch anti-aircraft guided missiles. Many are also equipped to carry out anti-submarine, anti-air and anti-surface operations. So this is it as far as the analysis of today's newspaper is concerned. Let us now move on and have a look at question of the day.